Hello. I was asked to do a session today up near Felixstowe on storytelling and how to tell stories and the uses of storytelling. Unfortunately, I couldn't cover the higher of the hall with not many people want to go. So this recording is partly for the benefit of those handful of people who did want to go, but who kind of got their refunds because, I say, the person hiring the hall couldn't get enough people interested. Um, But also, I've had a request from other people, friends in Sweden, for example, who would like to know more about this sort of thing. So this is for their benefit as well as the people who are going to be attending the event had it taken place today. This might be a bit rambling and incoherent, but then anyone who's ever watched anything on my channel will be used to me being rambling and incoherent. Uh, the idea that I was going to start the day in Felixstowe, or well, near Felixstowe, with was going to be exploring the idea of story as a form of healing, as a form of therapy, which is also what the people in Sweden have asked about. Um, this is quite a sprawling area in that there are a number of different theorists and people who have advanced ideas on how story can be used both as therapy and as a diagnostic, if you like, of what is causing somebody's emotional problems in the first place, and sometimes to an extent physical problems. Not that bad stories can cause a broken arm or emphysema or something as bizarre as that, but rather that people's capacity and willingness to take care of their bodily health is partially influenced by their understanding of issues related to life narrative. So it's not that the story causes the broken arm, it's that they might not take care of their broken arm if they have the least functional type of story going around their head. And so that's kind of where I'm going to pick up on a little bit. But I'm thinking of this more from the mystic magic woo-woo end of the market rather than the more autobiographical approach that clinical therapists take within, for example, logotherapy and narrative therapy and so on, although we'll mention those as we go along. So just to give you the kind of gist of the idea, there's a Viktor Frankl, who was a survivor of the death camps, an incredible man who wrote many, many very, very moving, very profoundly insightful books. Once the war was over, he went on and he finished his education and so forth and became a therapist. He kind of turned the absolute horror of what he had lived through in the concentration camps into an understanding of humanity and of life and of how he could help other people. Part of his argument was that he witnessed, whilst he was in the camps, other people, some of whom succumbed to the horror and the awfulness very, very quickly and died, and others of whom somehow survived against all of the odds, like himself really, and managed to get through. And his theorizing was that part of what helped the survivors survive was that they had a resilient approach to life, where in the face of unimaginable wickedness, they were able to place meaning on what was happening to them, whereas other people could not place meaning on it. It was the total loss of meaning that led to their capacity to resist and survive and be resilient to crumble and collapse, so that when horrifying things were done to them, they what very little food they were given, they weren't eating it, that sort of thing. So he was arguing that they had kind of withdrawn from the nightmare that they were in. And obviously the vast majority of people, thankfully, will never experience those extremes of horror. But when he was a therapist working with clients in the decades after the war, smaller scale problems that people experienced, he said nonetheless there were those who could live through really horrible, terrible, awful things, bereavement, sexual abuse, violence, all manner of things that might have happened to them. And some would pull through by finding meaning in what they were experiencing, and others would crumble and be weighed down by the awfulness of it because they could not find meaning for it. So he developed this argument, this idea, that a practice of logotherapy, words as therapy, if you like, which is contingent on both the idea that words can harm and words can heal, and narrative therapy, which was developed in Australia initially, has a similar kind of an argument that the thing that causes the harm is also, if it's changed around, the thing that can pull someone through and help them. And part of what I'll argue, if I ever get to it, is ideas around more mythical uses of stories, which are also therapeutic, I would suggest. So, without dwelling too much on Viktor Frankl's ideas, because you could talk for hours and hours and hours about those alone, it's the sort of scenario that people might find themselves in. Let's say you've got some chap, Fred, who is engaged to be married to a lovely woman and everything, got a great job and a nice home and plans for the future, and they're going to move in and they're going to have kids and they're going to do this and they're going to do that. And one day there's a knock on the door and there's a police officer standing there who says, "Got bad news for you, your fiance has just been run over and killed by a drunk driver." And in that split second, not only is the fiance and her family and all of the grief and the pain there, but all of Fred's hopes, his dreams, his love for her, his plans of what they would do together in the future, in the decades to come, all of that in a split second is gone. Is there a meaning to that? Now, for followers of Vedic religions like Hinduism, Sikhism, and so forth, there is this notion of karma, that things happen for a reason. Nothing happens randomly, pointlessly. There is always a purpose. Many devout Christians, devout Jews, Muslims, and so forth will say, well, in God's will, this has been allowed to happen. So God hasn't caused the drunk driver to run the woman over, but has allowed it because there is a purpose to it. And often the arguments there are that we as humans, as mortals, we only see a little bit of the woods. We don't see the big forest. We see the trees and not the woods, if you like. So we seldom see the big grand picture. And understanding why these vast complex things have happened is something that is only possible if you are God or some sort of divine entity. You can look down from above, as it were, and see the vast story unfolding. Then you understand why things are happening. I suppose if you want to draw a very cheesy analogy, you're reading an Agatha Christie and small things happen in the plot. You think, what's the point of that? And it's only when you get to the last page and Miss Marple or Hugh Poirot twiddles his big moustache and says, aha, well, the significance of this event was blah, 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 and then everything makes sense. And whether at a human scale, the twirling of the big moustache and the big reveal comes when we're dead and we're in the afterlife, and some divine entity goes, well, actually, the reason that happened was this, and the reason this happened was that. And then it all makes sense, and we go, oh, obviously. And suddenly it all seems, straightforward, and we think, why didn't we get that in the first place? Or maybe if you're going more down a sort of a Buddhist line, you could say within the course of your own lifetime, without needing to be dead first, you might attain a degree of enlightenment and understanding and think, that's why the world is the way it is. This is why this happened. This is why that happened. Now, from a bigger picture, from a distance, now it all makes sense. And there you find the meaning. And when you find the meaning, even tragedies and sorrows and shit and grief and awful things that have happened to you become bearable, which is Frankl's argument that the same event can happen to two different people. One finds a meaning, or if you prefer, creates a meaning to it, and the other doesn't find or doesn't create a meaning, and it seems random and pointless. And there was no significance to this drunk driving idiot getting behind the wheel of a car and running over the fiancée. It was a tragedy. It didn't need to happen. There was no point to it, no significance to it. It was just horrible bad luck with no place in the grand scheme of anything, because for some people, of course, there is no grand scheme of anything. Life is just a series of fairly random, fairly meaningless events. Stuff happens. There's no great point to any of it. Then you die. which is a somewhat bleak view of life, but held by a great many people. And Frankel argues if you have that very bleak view of life, you find it much harder to struggle through and cope when shit and grief does happen. And I suppose you could equally argue, there is a Hindu quote along the, I forget it word for word, but it's along the lines of, when bad things happen to you, people will say, why me, why me? They very rarely, when good things happen to them, go, why me, why me? They just kind of accept the good and say, yay, I deserve that, and move on. In a similar vein, if there is no significance behind terrible events, there is no significance behind fantastic, wonderful events. It's all blind luck. It's all just kind of random and falls out of the sky. Or you take the approach that there is meaning, there is significance. And what the hell has any of this to do with stories? Well, the argument for Frankel and for people like Michael White and David Epstein, who invented narrative therapy, they argue meaning is story, or if you prefer, story is meaning. We tell ourselves stories of our lives. And we tell other people stories of our lives. When we're sitting down saying, oh, last Wednesday I did so-and-so. It may only be a 30-second anecdote. I know. I missed the bus, it started raining, I got soaked to the skin, and by the time I got home I had a cold. It's hardly Shakespeare, but it is nonetheless a story, an event, a narrative of our life. And there are different styles of narrative, and you can draw very close analogies to literature, or you can think in other perspectives on this one. But in narratives, in stories, we are used to having goodies and baddies, heroes and villains, and kind of comic support characters, and the wise old what's-it who comes along to provide knowledge that moves the plot along. There are tropes and devices that are very, very common to fiction the world over, going back to ancient mythology and legend and the primal stories. And the argument is that our minds tend to think in these ways. We are evolved, socialized, or you can phrase it in a number of different possible ways, but our minds naturally tend to think in certain ways. Are we the heroes of our own stories? Are we the bold, courageous, upstanding, noble, decent guys and girls who are leading our tale? Or do we not feel heroic at all? Do we feel insignificant and irrelevant? That maybe some days we feel as if some other person we know, they're the big character, the big personality, the dominant force, the hero, and we're just some sort of footnote in their story, rather than having anything particularly exciting ever happen to us. And so, again, the argument is if you have a very negative self-narrative, you tend to spiral down into, well, sadness initially, maybe in the longer term clinical depression. You struggle to cope with situations, you often don't put yourself forward when you could have done, and so there are a ton of missed opportunities in life because you never feel worthy or never feel you're capable of doing them. And you tell yourselves we all tell ourselves stories about the kind of person we are. Am I a funny person? Am I a wise person? Am I a stupid person? Am I a beautiful, handsome person? Or a ugly dollop of a person? We have these tales of ourselves, these self-images. And it's common enough for psychologists these days to bang on and on and on about self-esteem, often neglecting the fact that people with very low self-esteem can still nonetheless achieve amazing things. People with major psychological problems have changed the world for the better. So you don't have to be full of Californian joie de vivre and bounce in order to have a good life and be loved and do wonderful things. You can wallow in your own misery and still have, inspire love of other people and still achieve amazing things. So that the two don't wholly go together. But in order to do amazing things, you've most of the time got to be willing to take chances, willing to set forth on a path and do things that maybe at the very beginning you don't really think you're capable of doing, but then you think, oh bollocks, I'll give it a go, and you move forward and you achieve stuff. But that's all down to how you see yourself and a narrative of life. And this is where we come to a Canadian theorist, Erich Berne, who took ideas from Sigmund Freud and ran with them and sort of, I was going to say tidied them up a bit, but he reworked some of Freud's ideas and came up with transactional analysis. We won't go down that very much because that's a whole other thing. But one of the aspects of his ideas was what he termed life scripts. And he said a life script is basically a story you tell yourself. But when do people stay? Do they wake up one Friday afternoon and think, oh, I'll start telling myself a story now? He said no. By and large, most of us inherit stories. Just as we inherit hair colour and eye colour and all that sort of thing, and money and what have you. So we inherit stories from usually our parents or whoever it is that brings you up and has a dominant influence over you. And of course, if you're brought up in a two-parent household, then the stories your dad tells you might be different from the stories your mother tells you. So which one becomes most dominant in your life is often down to which of the two characters has you spend more time with, or they make a greater impression on you, and all sorts of other factors come into it. But somewhere along the line, it could be parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. These days we might even factor in TV and film and social media. Once upon a time we could have said novels, but who knows how many people actually read these days as youngsters. These factors shape, when we are very, very, very young, the stories that appeal to us, the stories that we take so deeply on board, we forget they're there. And this is kind of Berne's argument around the life script. It's not that you wake up every morning and you recite Hansel and Gretel to yourself or something as bizarre as that. Rather, these are autobiographical tales of the kind of person I am, the kind of person my parents were, my grandparents were, and back to the year dot. So not only do you have the individual story of me, but the collective story, the story of my people and the kinds of people we are. And these pass down as cultural tales, and we fit into them with greater or lesser efficiency, as it were. Either we slot in comfortably, or maybe we're a bit of an awkward fit with the story, but we are aware of the story nonetheless. So various layers of story that shape us, influence us, guide us to be the kinds of people as adults that we become. And even if we don't consciously sit there in front of a mirror reciting stories to ourselves, and who does that, we meet a stranger on the bus or the train, and we exchange pleasantries, and you don't give them your entire life story, obviously, but you might put a snippet forward in which it's obvious to the person listening that either you're very optimistic and very upbeat and very confident and dynamic and you're a bit of a go-ahead character, or maybe you're very timid, you're very shy, you have very little self-esteem, you're a bit mousy and always beefing others up and putting yourself on the back foot, or maybe you're a very aggressive, belligerent, angry person, or maybe you're a very calm, placid person who just rolls with life's happenings. They'll get a sense of who you are, even from a fairly short 2-3 minute anecdote that you tell them whilst you're sitting on the train. And the argument here from people like Eric Berne is that we tend to tell the same basic pattern of stories. So even if the detail of the story changes from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday to Thursday, when you're sitting down recounting snippets of your life to other people, be that complete strangers, be it friends, be it family, be it your employer, your colleagues, whoever, it tends to always be an upbeat one, or always a miserable one, or always a placid one, or always an angry one. There is a commonality of pattern there. And that commonality of pattern is the narrative, the story of our lives, the story that we tell ourselves. What Eric Berne does is draw in Greek mythology. This is obviously something he got from Freud, who loved his Greek mythology and was always drawing it into various different things. So that's one of the reasons I want to bring him in, because I like the Greek myth too. He said there are 6 major stories which people tell each other, which he tied into Greek myth initially. His books eventually dropped the Greek myth element, perhaps because his publishers probably told him that people didn't understand it, and if he wanted to be popular, he had to simplify it. So he eventually renamed them other slightly more, should we say, catchy things that people could understand who didn't have a classical background or classical education. But we'll stick with Greek, because I say I like the Greek. So I'll run through the 6 things very, very briefly. As well as putting this on YouTube, I'm going to put it on the blog, and on the blog I'll write some of these terms down. So if I talk too quickly and you think, oh, what was that name? What did he say? Then you can see the written notes on the blog, which hopefully, if this is something that interests you at all, hopefully that will be of some degree of use. So this is in no particular order. These are the 6 life scripts that he said are the most common ones to cause problems. So he didn't say they were the only life scripts ever. You're not limited to a choice of 6, but these are the 6 he most commonly encountered with his patients, his clients in therapy. So first off, he said there is the script of Sisyphus, and in Greek myth, if you're unfamiliar, Sisyphus is a wicked king who is sent down as a punishment to Tartarus, which is kind of like the Greek hell, sort of ish. And his punishment is that there is this very big pointy mountain, and he has this bloody great big boulder, which he has to roll all of the way up to the top of the mountain. And he's told, once that boulder balances on the pinnacle of the mountain, then he will be released from his punishment. But of course the mountain is so pointy that what always happens is as soon as he gets to the top, a split second later it rolls down again the other side, and he's been there 1,000 years going up one side and down the other. He never rests, because the task he wants to achieve is an impossible task. And so that's the key gist that Berne was getting at, that there are many people in the world who are rolling a metaphorical boulder up a mountain in order to balance it at the top, but it never will. The task they have set themselves, and bearing in mind a lot of this comes from childhood, so you could make the argument that maybe it was a parent or some other influential adult who set the task, and the child just kind of absorbed it at a very young age and has never released that pattern as an adult. Whatever it is in life they want to do, they feel very driven, they've got to do this, they can never rest, they can never be happy, they can never be content, they can never do all the other things they want to do until this specific task is done. But it's always scuppered because the very nature of the task is impossible. It cannot be achieved. So in other words, they will never get their boulder, whatever it may be in their life, to the top of the mountain. Therefore they will never be able to go and have that nice holiday they want to have, or fall in love with whoever it is they want to fall in love with, or do any of the other things they might want to do, which they keep saying to themselves, when I am free of this, I'll go and do X and Y and Z. They never will. That's the point. And part of Berne's argument is that, yes, it comes from usually parental programming initially, or cultural programming, you could argue, at a more sort of sociological level. But there's also a sort of a functionality to this, in that maybe by the time you're 30 or 40, you're still following the same old pattern again and again and again in life. Maybe it has started to serve a purpose for you. So initially the purpose may have been for the influential adult, the parent, whoever, in childhood, but by the time you are fully grown and you can't keep blaming your parents for everything forever, there comes a stage when maybe this individual is so nervous of doing the X, the Y and the Z, the other things they could be doing, that having this impossible task becomes a damn good excuse for never doing the other things. Then they don't have to take those risks. Then they don't have to maybe discover their lifelong dreams turn out to be a bit rubbish when they get there, like wanting always to go on holiday to a particular country for years on end, and finally you get there and it's crap. It's not the holiday of your dreams at all. It was nothing like you thought it would be. And that's quite disappointing. And if you transpose that to some other type of life situation, a person might have this anxiety at the back of their head that this thing I've always wanted to do, this dream I've had for donkey's years, if I ever do it, is it going to be a flop? Therefore, if I never do it, I just keep dreaming it and dreaming it, maybe the dream will be more fun than the reality. And so, oh no, I can't do it because I've got to complete this other task first, becomes a damn good excuse never to fulfill the dream. So you could, if you're looking to some form of therapy, well, not so much you going in therapy, but you're looking to provide a healing service through storytelling to other people. That could be an argument. And just before we go on to the next one, people like the narrative therapists and the logotherapists, people following the tradition of Frankl and White and Epstein and so on, they have ongoing relationships with their clients. Obviously, they don't just see them the once. And normally, they see them plenty of times, and they discuss these issues on many separate occasions. That is the sort of therapeutic, qualified, professionalized approach. You might, as a storyteller, normally the standard thing as a storyteller, you get a book and you go in, you tell the story, you say bye bye and go home again. You don't necessarily ever see anyone in that audience ever again. But that one moment, that half hour, 3 hours, however long the storytelling event lasts, you tell a story in that time, and someone in that audience goes, oh, actually, suddenly something makes sense in my life, because something from that story clicks in their head and it has an impact. And so you can have that very informal kind of story therapy where, I mean, it could be just sheer chance. You've got no idea who's in the audience, and by sheer fluke or karma or whatever you want to say it is, the tale you tell works for them. Equally, you might, on occasion, know who is in the audience, or at least some of them at any rate, and you might think, well, I know they've got an issue about so-and-so thing in their life. If I tell this story, that might help. It might not. You're unlikely to be talking to them lying on a couch for 6 months afterwards to find out the impact of the story, but you might kind of seek to engineer a change in at least one, if not several people in your audience on the basis of your pre-existing knowledge about their life, and that has a sort of a healing role, a therapeutic role, not in the same way as a professional qualified healer has, but where you are in a very amateurish way thinking, I wonder if this story would be helpful for them. And that's kind of more the thing I'm thinking of. And had this Saturday event taken place, that's what we would have gone down, that line, rather than the ongoing therapeutic relationship line of the highly qualified professional. Anyway, that aside, shunt on to the next life script. Hercules, or if you want to be very Greek, Heracles. Big story, lots of aspects to his story. The bit that Berne was interested in was the 12 labours. Short version of that story, very, very short version of that story, is that Heracles had been driven mad by the schemings of a goddess, the goddess Hera, or in the Roman version, Juno. And as part of this madness, he had murdered his own wife and children. Not entirely his own fault, because he was being used as a puppet, made to do this, but that's a moot point. When the madness wore off and he realised what he had done, he was so horrified, as anyone would be, that he sought to atone and make good the wicked thing that he had done. So even though you've got this moral ambiguity, was it entirely his fault because he was being controlled and manipulated? But we often take on board in our life guilt and blame for things that may not really be entirely our fault, that we may have been pushed into situations, and that there are perhaps other people who are more culpable than we are. But nonetheless, we live with that guilt, especially guilt for things that happen when we're very young and we don't fully understand situations, but people live with it. And the point being that he is then given these 12 impossible labours to perform in order to atone for his guilt. And so it's one bizarre, enormous challenge after another, after another, after another. And only when all 12 are done can he feel cleansed and purified. And the miasma, the Greek idea of sort of sin, for lack of a better word, that has stained his soul from these murders. Only then can he be free to start his life again, and also free to feel that the ghosts of his dead wife and children have been laid to rest, given peace. So it's a bit of a gruesome, grim tale. and not a directly easy one to relate to everyday life events of people in your audience as your storyteller. But here the argument is that the person has guilt, they have sense of feeling damned by something they either definitely have done, or at the very least they believe they have done in their past, they believe they are responsible for. And in order to cleanse themselves, in order to atone, to start again, to make right what has gone wrong, they have to do these ridiculous, bizarre, and impossible things. So I suppose a little bit like Sisyphus with the impossible boulder pushed up the hill, except with Sisyphus it's always the same bloody thing again and again and again. With Heracles it's different things. Today it's this impossible task, next year it's that impossible task. But even as these succession of bizarre and impossible events roll through life, there is still this underlying idea that this tormented soul will never feel peace, will never feel that they have put right what they have done wrong, never feel that they have atoned for their whatever sin or burden or miasma it is that stains them. Whether it's, again, a parent or society or their own self-condemnation, the sense of I won't be happy until I've done this thing, that I'm going to choose a thing or accept a thing being given to me, which is just ludicrously impossible to do. Ridiculously hard, ridiculously over the top. That's the kind of key crux to that life pattern of people who set themselves or take on board goals set for them by other people, which are just crazy, over the top, will take years and years and years and ludicrous amounts of effort to do. And even if you somehow eventually manage to do this one, 5 minutes later there'll be another ridiculously impossible task to do. And so at no point is there any chance to be free of it. So the person is never happy. The next life script is the tale of Arachne. And Arachne is the figure from Greek myth who was a weaver, a human woman. She was a remarkably good weaver. She made cloth, sitting there with her spinning wheel and all the rest of it. And one day she rather foolishly committed the sin of hubris, of bragging that she was better than the very gods themselves. And she said, I am better at weaving than Athena, the goddess of one of whose areas of influence and control is weaving, household arts and crafts and tasks. And the one thing you don't do with the Greek gods, or any god for that matter, is put yourself above them. That's just asking for trouble. And so with a sort of a crack out of nowhere appears Athena, and she says, right, you uppity bint, sitting there thinking you're better than me. I will condemn you to spend the rest of eternity weaving. And zaps her with a bit of magic and turns her into a spider. It doesn't state that she is the very first spider in existence, but it kind of implies that she is the ancestress of all spiders. And so for the rest of eternity, presumably she's an immortal spider, she just weaves and weaves and weaves and weaves and weaves. How does that translate into a human life? Well, Berne's argument is that there are people, many people in the world, who are really good at things, really, really good at things. And they enjoy doing them. They're very talented. They could be a great singer, a great writer, a great tap dancer, a great cake baker, a great car engineer, or whatever it is, doesn't really matter. They have some talent, some skill they are extremely good at. And other people always want them to do that thing. They get request after request after request, and no one ever asks them to do anything else. And therein is the rub, that it becomes really bloody boring. If you do the same frigging thing all of the time, you never get variety, you never get recognised in any other light. And it's the monotony that becomes the issue. So they are trapped by their own success, in effect. They're so good at something, they never get the chance to be good at anything else. They never get the chance to explore and experience. And their life becomes a sort of, what can we say, a one-trick pony, if you like, or one-trick spider. and therein lies a whole raft of issues. I think it was Dorothy Parker, the American columnist and wit, who advised one of the very few straight male friends she had that if he wanted to seduce clever women, he should tell them they were beautiful. And if he wanted to seduce beautiful women, he should tell them they were clever. Because if you're always, there's nothing wrong being clever, there's nothing wrong being beautiful. But if all you ever hear is the same thing again and again and again, how clever you are, how clever you are, how clever you are, after a while it gets really bloody boring. And on the rare occasion anyone values you for something other than that one thing, you tend to go a little bit weak-kneed and are more pliable. Very, very cynical of Dorothy Parker, but undoubtedly true. And so people with an Arachne life script are condemned by their own success to live a one-track life, and thus they can break free of the story. And of course that's the point of the therapy, is that all of these stories are things you can break free of. You don't have to be condemned forever and ever. Part of the key to breaking free is to become aware you've got a story in the first place, and that's where the lying on couches bit comes into it. The therapist will help you realise what your story is by listening to you and say, well, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? Giving you a bit of feedback. And then one day you go, oh, bugger, actually, yes, I have been doing that same thing for the last 30, 40, 50 years or whatever it may be. And when you know you've got a story, that's when you're in a position to step back from your script and say, actually, I don't like this story. I've done it. I've had enough of it. I want a new story. And when you decide you want a new story, but first of all, you have to choose what the new story is. They don't just fall out of the sky. So you decide, if I don't want life A, what is life B going to be like? What kind of life do I want? And you have to mull that over and think it through. And as per most therapists will tell you, they can't tell you what life you should have. They could suggest a dozen possibilities, but at the end of the day, it's down to you to decide, what new story do I want to tell in my life? And then you begin telling it. And that's where we kind of get to people like the French psychologist Coué, whose arguments around what eventually became called Couéisms formed the basis of the works of people like Edward de Bono, who sold a ton of books. I'm okay, you're okay, and all that sort of cobblers. That if you tell yourself something often enough, first dozen times you do it, you feel like a right knob. But eventually, it becomes second nature. And so you learn to tell a new story by saying, I am not going to repeat these patterns. I am going to think in this way, in this way, in this way. You tell that new tale, and eventually it becomes part of you. There's something I want to come back to with that as we go along, but we'll do the other three life scripts first. How are we doing? God, this is taking longer than I thought. The other ones is that there's a joint one between two characters, Bacchus and Philemon. The Greek myth being that Zeus came along in disguise, as he always does, and he encountered these two sweet old dears, Bacchus and Philemon, who were husband and wife, had been married for Lord knows how long. And he turns up looking like a wandering beggar, a bit rough and raggedy, and they take him in, they give him some moussaka and some resin or whatever they give him. They settle him down to his life. Sorry, his meal rather, and they take care of him, and they provide him with clean clothes and all of this. And he's so impressed by their kindness, by their generosity, by their hospitality, he rewards them. And the reward is that he turns husband and wife each into a tree. And they grow up like this, and their branches conjoin. And so as trees, obviously, they will live a damn sight longer than they ever could have done as human beings. And they are entwined and entangled with each other, and their love goes on for hundreds and hundreds of years as trees. It's meant to be a wonderful romantic thing, but Berne said, my God, how boring must that be? To achieve what you want to achieve very, very early in life, and then the rest of your life is content. No challenge, no difficulty, no mountains to overcome. It's all just kind of cruising along. And at first it probably does feel absolutely wonderful. But after a while, my God, you would get bored with it. And there is an old Twilight Zone episode. I think the actor was called Victor Buono. A man dies, a gangster gets shot down. This is an old black and white one, which gives you an idea of how old it was. So a gangster gets shot down in an alley, and he wakes up in the afterlife. And there's Victor Buono in a nice suit and what have you. And he says, "Oh, this is your afterlife. Come, I will show you around." And there's casinos and nightclubs and all sorts of things. And they go into the casino, and he wins immediately on his first gamble. And all of the pretty girls in the nightclub come and sort of fawn over him. And he thinks he's in heaven. It's absolutely bloody fantastic. It couldn't be better. And the episode rolls on, and after a while, he's been there a few days, a few weeks, and he meets up with Victor Buono again, and he says, "I am so bored. Every time I go gambling, I win. Every woman I ask on a date goes out with me and thinks I'm the best thing since sliced bread. Every single thing I do works perfectly. I'm in heaven, and yet I'm bored." And Victor Buono turns around and goes, "Oh, actually, you're not in heaven. This is hell. I'm the devil." And for the next million years, or however long he's going to be in hell for, everything he does, this guy will go perfectly. And what's the point of gambling? This is kind of the gist. What is the point of gambling if you know you'll win every time? There's no excitement, there's no risk, there's no, "Oh, will I win, will I lose?" You know, it's a done deal. And what seems like heaven at first becomes, through monotony and repetition, hell. And therein we have the tale of Bacchus and Philemon, that what sounds really great, if it happens too early in life, you kind of peak too early, you get bored with the lack of challenge, the lack of dynamism, the lack of excitement, the lack of risk. It all becomes too cushy. And so people have tedious lives. It's the kind of thing you might want to try for a little while, isn't it? Just to see what it's like. But Berne said you wouldn't want to do it for a long period of time. The other two are Tantalus. Tantalus, again, wicked king, condemned to torment in Tartarus. His sin, his crime, why he was sent there in the first place, is because he was very stingy and mean, and wouldn't give generously to not only his own citizens, but to the gods and all sorts of others. And so he is chained up in a lake of wine. Well, sometimes it's wine, sometimes it's water. It doesn't really matter what the liquid is. But he's chained up in this lake. And he's chronically thirsty. But every time he bends down to have a drink, the liquid, be it wine or water, recedes and drains away. So he can never drink. And he's always hungry. And above his head is a branch, a grapevine, with this huge, great big bunch of the world's nicest looking grapes. But every time he reaches up to get one, and bearing in mind he's chained up, so he's not free to move, every time he moves up to try and get it, the branch lifts out of the way. And so he forever sees the thing he wants, but is denied it. And from Tantalus we get the word to tantalize, to torment someone with the thing they want, but not give it to them. And so Berne said there's lots of people in life who they want to have romance, the beautiful woman, the handsome man, whatever it is that they're after in life. And they meet these amazing people, and every time they kind of move forward to say, "Oh, would you like to go on a date?" and maybe what have you, somebody else gets in there first. Or the person moves away, and they see the person they want, but they can never have it. That promotion at work, they really, really want it, they go for it, they work hard for it, they never get it. Somebody else gets it. They want the £1,000,000, they buy the lottery ticket, some other bugger wins it. It's never them. And Berne's argument is that this is not bad luck. This is an engineered situation. This is a devised situation. So that if that beautiful woman or handsome man gets snapped up by somebody else, or just walks out the room and is never seen again, or whatever it may be, it's because the person, the client in therapy, delayed too long. or they behaved in a weird way without realizing it, and it alienated that person. So in other words, that person is self-sabotaging. They know what they want in life, but they always prevent themselves from having it. They always undermine themselves. So it's not that some karmic force is blocking them. It's rather their own self-sabotaging actions that screw up the interview for the job promotion, or the romantic date, or the whatever the thing is that they want. They undermine themselves all of the time. And so a bit like that Shirley Bassey song, have always got their nose pressed up against the window pane, seeing people having a smashing life on the other side of the glass, but they never get past the glass. But it's because they won't make the moves, they won't take the chances, they won't do the thing that they need to do to get there. They could do it. This is the thing for Berne. They could do it. It is possible, but they won't. And they blame anyone and everyone except take responsibility for their own poor choices. Last one is Damocles. Yet another rotten king. Ancient Greece must have been knee-deep in rotten kings. Damocles sits at his banquet table, and the curse that's laid upon him is that up there, dangling over his head, is an enormous great sword, and it's hanging magically. So wherever he moves, the sword moves with him, a bit like one of those old Tom and Jerry cartoons with the rain cloud that always goes over the cartoon characters no matter where they go. So he's indoors, he's outdoors, it doesn't matter where the hell Damocles goes, the magic sword follows him. And he's been told that one day the sword will drop and go straight through the top of his head and kill him. And he knows that. And so when he's eating his wonderful banquets and he's in bed with his wife and his mistresses or whatever he's up to, no matter what fun, exciting, wonderful thing he's doing, his mind is always on the sword, wondering when the sword will drop. Is this my last day? Is this the end of happiness? Today, tomorrow, in an hour, in 5 minutes? So he's never in the moment, he's never enjoying it, he's never doing that Buddhist thing of being in the here and the now and enjoying the moment. He's always got this fear of when will it end? Now that, as Berne has pointed out, exists for every single one of us. We are all going to die. Unless we join the ranks of the undead, we are all going to die. No matter how fantastic your life is, how rich, powerful, handsome, beautiful, clever, whatever the hell else you are, you'll be dead at some point. But do we live our lives dreading the end, or do we just get on with it and enjoy the moment? For Berne, the happy, content life is get the hell on with it and enjoy the moment, obviously. You don't spend your life going, I'm going to die, it's all going to end. And it's not necessarily always death that people are tormented by. They've got a fantastic job and they're really worried that one day they'll get sacked or they'll be forced to retire or whatever. There's always the fear, the anxiety, it's going to end. And so they never enjoy the moment. But again, other people do enjoy the moment. It's perfectly possible for them to enjoy the moment. They've just got to get over this angst about loss and death and grief and mourning. And some people really struggle with that. And that's partly because of the stories, arguably, they have been told through their lives and that they have swallowed wholesale and become part and parcel of their lives. Which brings us, rather belatedly, to another angle I want to mention and talk about. Back in the 70s, an author called Colette Downing wrote a book called The Cinderella Complex. It was one of these early feminist things. It's fallen out of favour a little bit now, but it's worth mentioning anyway. Her argument is that little girls all over Western Europe, at any rate, if not anywhere else, hear the Cinderella story 1,000 times over. Bedtime reading and Disney films and all the rest of it. What is the Cinderella story? It's some poor put-upon woman who is drudging in the kitchen, being shouted at and screamed at by the ugly sisters and the wicked stepmother. She's got this bloody, miserable, awful life. And if she waits and waits and waits and waits and waits, eventually the handsome prince will come along, whop the shoe out, who her missus, and her life will be sorted. What she needs to do, Cinderella, is wait. Just back in a second. Restless dog. And Dowling's argument is that this is a story told in 1001 different forms and varieties to little girls, primarily more so than little boys, that if they wait, eventually the handsome prince, some bloke, will come along and make their lives better. Or to put it in another way, they should not try to make their own life better, they should wait for a man to do it for them. And her argument back in the 70s is that this is a kind of, or was then at any rate, a widespread condition for women. It's pacifying them, it's making them inert. Instead of becoming, returning to an earlier theme, the heroines of their own lives and getting out and saying, right, I want a better job, I want this, I want that, I want to travel the world, I want to do the next thing. Instead of doing it for themselves, I'm not going to break into a rousing chorus of sisters are doing it for themselves, but that was the gist of her argument. Instead of doing that, they just sit there like lemons and wait for some bloke to do the running, which is not good for them, and you could argue it's probably not very good for the bloke either if they have to do all the work while she just sits there. A better story to tell will be one in which the heroine is more dynamic. And this is the key to what I want to get at in that Dowling's argument is that this isn't quite so much the sort of family life script inheritance that Berne was talking about. This was actual story. So when you open the children's storybook and read to your daughter at bedtime, when you turn on the TV and put on the Walt Disney DVD, or you take them to the Christmas panto or whatever it is, whether it's Cinderella or some very similar kind of story in which you've got a very passive female figure at the centre of the story who just sits there like a lump waiting for a man to come along and make her life better. If you've heard that not once but 1,000 times over during the course of your childhood, especially your very young childhood, actual stories in the usual sense of the word of story, rather than this kind of autobiographical narrative, which is what Berne and Epstein and White and all these other people are on about, then actual stories have a significant impact on the individuals that hear a lot of them. And you can branch that out to say that in cultures generally, you find very common stories. So the stories that are very common for French children to hear might be very different from the stories that are very common for Japanese children to hear, or for Zimbabwean children to hear. So cultures have their own peculiar stories. Obviously, in this day and age of TV and internet, you can hear stories from far-flung parts of the world, but by and large, what you tend to hear most are the stories most commonly told in your own culture. So you get used to certain themes, certain ideas, certain concepts. And stories have this element to them, which is something that Levi Strauss and a load of other people spoke about, where they reinforce culture's tropes, cultural values, cultural morals. So if the culture says, as a woman, well, you just sit there and do your housework, and a man will make your life better for you. If you hear it often enough, it becomes second nature. You expect it. You don't even realise that that's how you're thinking. And this is kind of Burns' argument that you hear a story so often it becomes white noise and you forget it's there. And the struggle, the process to healing and to therapy and to breaking free is to make the story conscious, to realise, that's the story that's playing in the back of my head. That's what I've heard a million times over. That's what is shaping me to live the kind of life I am now living, which is making me so bloody miserable and unhappy. And then think of new stories. And therein is the challenge. What are those new stories? So the new story could be a story you make up on the spur of the moment, or it could be a traditional tale, a myth, a legend, but one that you're not familiar with, one that would liberate you. And that's what I want to argue, or would have argued at any rate, for the Saturday morning thing, that as a storyteller, whether you're reciting ancient myths and legends, or whether you're making up stories on the spur of the moment yourself, you are presenting tales to an audience. And I don't think there's anything wrong in telling Cinderella stories. It's a perfectly nice story. The issue is if you've heard it for the 50 millionth time and it's started to affect your mind. But you can introduce new stories your audience may be unfamiliar with, that get them to think of themselves, get them to think of society, get them to think of the world from a different angle. Maybe a more liberating angle, or an angle that challenges whatever the miseries and conditioning of their old story has been. How do you get them to think of things from a new angle, a new way, a new light? Um, White and Epstein, in their narrative therapy, which is very much focused on autobiographical tales, people's stories of their lives, their family, and so on, they use the phrase re-authoring, that in the therapy process, the individual, the client, learns to tell their own story anew from a different angle in a different way. So you could have a story in which you go on and on about all the miserable, awful, terrible things that have ever happened to you and your family, all the deaths, the unemployment, the disease, the poverty, Lord knows what else might have happened to you over the years. And in the constant theme of those stories is that you're a victim. Poor little me, I've been abused and misused and put upon. And if you are a victim, you identify as a victim, you'll always bloody be a victim. This is the kind of point they're getting at. So even if you live for another 30, 40, 50 years, you'll continue to be a victim because you think of yourself as a victim. How about thinking of yourself as a survivor? So you're not pretending those deaths and periods of poverty and illness and whatnot didn't happen. It's not about inventing a silly made-up story that denies reality. It's about taking a new angle on reality to say, I am not a victim, I am a survivor. I was strong enough to survive those illnesses, to survive those bereavements, to survive getting sacked and having to find a new job, and I did this and I did that. And then you start telling a new story. You re-author your own life story in which you are a stronger character, a more resourceful character, a more dynamic character who is taking charge of things. And so if you live that extra 30, 40 years, you do so as a survivor, one who, if they are faced with problems in life, and who isn't going to be faced with problems in life eventually, you will be confident in your strength to overcome those problems because you've already done it 25 times previously. And so it's about changing the way you perceive yourself, changing the narrative, the biography, autobiography rather, of your own life. Again, that's the self-narrative focus. I like this idea of myths, legends, and so on, be it Cinderella, be it Robin Hood, Sir Galahad, Anansi, whoever or whatever, that there are tales told which, if you hear them often enough, change the way you think about how the world is, how you think about how you are, the kind of person you are, the kind of person you could be. And so I had this Saturday thing I had, would have had more discussions about different stories and how people perceive them and what impact those stories have had on their lives. But I've been rabbiting for almost an hour, crikey. So I'm going to draw this to a close, and if people are particularly interested in other aspects of this, then if they let me know, we can pick up on whatever aspects it is that you're interested in. But as a thing to leave you with, whether you're the person this recording is made for or you just chance upon it and it interests you, start by thinking about the kinds of stories and narratives that are common in the culture you live in. So whether you are Swedish, whether you are Chinese, whether you're Russian, whether you're whatever you are, Saudi Arabian or something or another, what stories are told most often in that culture? Perhaps start by thinking about stories very frequently told to children. What are the popular children's stories? The kinds of things that you might have heard dozens of times over when you were a small child. Once you start identifying and knock out a list of them, then think, what are the common patterns here? If you're male, how are men presented in this story? If you're female, how are women presented in this story? How do you understand yourself through the story? Do you feel like the hero of the story? Do you feel more like the villain of the story, or the comic relief, or the damsel in distress who has to be rescued? Where do you see yourself fitting into this story? Have you got favourite stories? Ones that stick with you and you love hearing them again and again? Are there stories that really got on your tits? You really didn't like them when you heard them, and you've never wanted to hear them again. Because things that irritate us are often quite useful for an insight. Why is it? What is it about that story that irritates you, that you didn't like about it? And what does that rubbing up the wrong way tell you about yourself and where you've been and where you're going in life? What kind of story if we're thinking in that more sort of narrative autobiographical thing, what kind of story would you like to be able to tell friends and relatives and children, if you have them, nephews and nieces or whatever you might have in your life, to tell them in the future? If you were telling the story of your life, do you want it to be, well, presumably most people want their life story to be a happy, jolly one, but what do you want the chief characteristics of your story to be? Do you want to be remembered as brave and courageous, or adventurous, or wise, or sweet, or gentle, or caring and nurturing of other people? How do you want to come across as a figure, as a character of influence? Um, because those are the kinds of stories that you would like to be told about you by other people. That's how you want them to remember you when you're dead and gone, and they're sharing stories of you at the funeral. What kinds of stories do you want them to be sharing? Or do you want them not to share any stories, just to forget you ever existed in the first place and have no narrative, which is a bit of a grim thing. So it's mulling over those ideas and trying to translate some of this into patterns of reality. And maybe after you've started with thinking about those mythical and legendary or folktale stories, or fairy tale stories, what have you, you could move on to thinking about the family stories. What are the tales of your family? The kind of things your mother and father and grandparents and aunties and uncles and whatnot tend to talk about a lot. How, I don't know, what your family did in the war, or if you've emigrated from one part of the world to another part of the world. What are the kind of stories of the transition of your family from place A to place B? Have you gone down in love? Your great-great-grandmother was as rich as Croesus and now you're all dirt poor. Or have you gone the other way up? Your ancestors used to live in a one-room shack and now you live in a 16-bedroom mansion. How has the story of your lineage played out from previous generations that you know about into your current life? Is it a tale of rag to riches or riches to rags? Is it a tale of crossing oceans and adventurous things, a story of war and heroism and bravery, or a story of cruelty and brutality and escaping from some dreadful relative or ancestor, your own immediate one, or maybe one a bit further back in time? Is it a tale of scandal and intrigue, or is it a tale of, I don't know, people with really bloody boring jobs who lived dull lives and then died of boredom at the age of 60? What is the story that you've got to bring out? And is that a story you're happy to continue and perpetuate in its current form? Or do you want to take it off in a whole new angle and go into a completely different direction from the one your previous familial generations have gone in? But we're now over an hour now, so I'm going to leave it there. And if you've got any feedback, put it either on YouTube or on the blog. Let me know what you think, and if there's interest, we'll do a second one, and if there's not, we won't. Thank you.